Good, rainy, cold, not May. George and I are here. We're going to try to tape another sermon for you. You will see it on Mother's Day. So happy Mother's Day to all of you, especially those of us who can't be either with our kids or with our mamas. It is a secular holiday, so I won't be preaching about it, but there is some liturgy in your order of worship that you will appreciate. And if you can think of God as mother, which is totally not traditional, that nurturing quality, especially that came through with Jesus, is a good reminder of how mothers are supposed to be and how we are to treat our mothers, for that matter. So, with that being said, the sermon today is based on 1 Peter 2, verses 2 to 10. And it is basically the story of Jesus as the cornerstone. And there's other things in it that can be preached, but that's what I chose to preach on today. And with Christ as the cornerstone, where do we fit in? Especially now when we don't have a church building. So let's take a look at some of this and go from there. We need encouragement, right? We need it on our jobs, we need it in our families, in our friendships, and especially we need it in our Christian life. And when we're not able to be in the church, which many of us identify as God's house and where we feel the closest to God, we need even more encouragement. And this particular part of 1 Peter, I think, does that. Because living as faithful witnesses for Christ in a world that doesn't always recognize Christ's authority, it's become a place of separation and diversity. And when you get into the kinds of things that have been happening in our world and especially in our nation, that separation becomes even more clear. I'm thinking in particular of all the different disparities with different races and ethnic groups that are coming to light, not only because of the pandemic, but because of some of the ways it's being handled. The same kind of thing was true for Christians, only the prejudice was directed right at them. As a small community of faith, they spread throughout Europe and the Roman Empire, and they were viewed with hostility and suspicion, and kind of as what are those people doing here? They lived on their messages of hope and encouragement that came from people like Paul, the other disciples, and also Peter. This is the context that 1 Peter was written in, and he put it in a letter that was circulated to all the churches in Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey. And the opening of the letter indicates that these early Christian communities were considered outsiders, almost certainly in relation to their faithful witness to Christ. And so Peter set out to bolster their faith. I just watched something on TV where Margaritaville man was singing to a bunch of nurses and his company giving them vacations for when this is over. That's the kind of thing that's been happening all across our nation, and I don't want us to miss whether there's Christian faith behind it or not. It's still an act of goodwill and faith. So our text picks up near the end of the main part of Peter's letter, and as a means of instilling hope, Peter has identified them, Christians, mostly Jews at that time becoming Christians, but also lots of people in the pagan world, as it was known. He's identifying them as the stones that the temple is made of. And he does that by connecting them to the key part of Israel's history, such as the Exodus from Egypt and their journey through the desert, and also to their status as the covenant people of God. And part of being this people of God meant growing in one's salvation even through the suffering of Jesus Christ. And it's hard, I think, for us modern day people to say that one must suffer in order to grow. But that's certainly what happened with our Christ. He suffered. He didn't grow, but he gave us the means to grow, not only in who we are as people, as followers of Christ, but in our faith in a world that God has made. That's why Peter starts off with that talk about infants and nourishing milk, because that's what infants need to grow, some sort of formula or their mother's milk. And just as the infants need that to grow and to prosper, so too does a Christian, because we all start out as infants in the faith, and we learn through life experience, we learn through sharing in a community of faith, and we learn and grow because of our relationship with God. But it's not something that just happens, it's something that we must nurture ourselves. And there's another reason that Peter encourages the early Christians toward increased growth and endurance. As Peter sees it, the churches he writes to are not simply outposts of Christ's kingdom in the ancient Roman world. They are certainly the center of the church. Where the people of God, where the people who follow Christ are, there is the church. And Peter speaks of the living stones here. Now, these aren't simply rocks you find on the ground. They are cut stones, hewn to precise dimensions for the construction of a building. You've all seen them. We have bricks here, but the stones that were talked about here are the ones that were used for the rough construction of things like the temple. And so when Peter calls us those stones, those living stones, what he's doing is connecting us to Christ, who is the cornerstone of that building. And whether we're able to be inside our church or not, we are the church. We are those stones, and we are connected to the cornerstone. And that's, I think, what Peter was trying to get people to understand, because many of them were imprisoned, many of them were persecuted, many of them were ostracized from their communities for choosing to be a Christian. And then the language that Jesus himself uses speaks to the temple of God. And Peter may have picked it up from Christ when he said that we're no longer in a physical locale like Jerusalem, but we are in the church of Jesus Christ, and it is because the church of Jesus Christ is in us. The coronavirus and the closing of buildings have moved us once again to consider who we are as the stones for God's temple. In other words, the church, empowered by Christ and the Holy Spirit, has the same kind of close, if not closer, access to God that the priests of ancient Israel did. And again, as they and we are reminded, this is only possible because of what Christ chose to do for us. Peter quotes the prophet Isaiah again, saying that God himself has laid a stone in Zion, a chosen and precious cornerstone. This stone in Zion, of course, is Jesus. And by quoting Isaiah, one of the greatest of the Hebrew prophets, Peter again gives the churches he is writing to both hope and encouragement. So Christ as the living stone was spoken of by the Hebrews centuries before Peter wrote, and as such the church's foundation finds its deep roots in the history of God and God's people. Peter's not only giving these churches hope, he's also giving them a history and thereby also a future. Before going any further, we need to take a quick aside to better understand what a cornerstone is. If you're in construction, you know, but if you're not, you might not. The cornerstone is the first stone that's laid into the ground when a building is being built. It's usually a larger stone, and it is a strong stone, and often we put a date on it to say what day that was built. It's the basis from which the rest of the building is put up. So the one stone shapes the direction and structure of the whole building. The cornerstone, especially in ancient architecture, determined how a building would be built. When Peter speaks of Christ as the cornerstone, then, he's using that same kind of building imagery. Christ is not only the mediator, he is the living cornerstone, the foundational rock upon which the church is built. Their structure and their direction, our structure and our direction, is determined by Christ. Now, of course, Christ would later call Peter the rock upon which he builds his church, but it didn't start there. Again, Peter quotes from the Old Testament, this time from the Psalms. And the supreme irony of the cross and the resurrection of Christ is not that the stone is the one that the human builders rejected. It is the stone that God made the foundational cornerstone. So what human beings cast aside, God picked up and used as the very cornerstone upon which to build his church. Not a physical building, but the building of people who are those living stones. Now, because Jesus is the living cornerstone of God, all those who are united in him participate in his resurrection life. In other words, it wouldn't have done anything for us if Christ had died and there had not been a reason behind it, if God had not been behind it. And if we can't see it as a gift to us, in spite of suffering, that gift that came through that was life. And the fact that 3 days after dying, Jesus raises from the dead. That's what this Easter season is all about, that we're in, reminding us who we are connected to. And now especially if we consider ourselves without a building, we are still the church of Jesus Christ. It's sort of the key to Peter's encouragement. It's kind of like him saying things will get better. It's not a trite saying, things will get better. They may not be the same as we know them, but they will get better. We will have to forge a new normal as church, as people of God, as citizens in a world that has all kinds of things that pull us astray. And how we do that really comes down to how we, in this pandemic, in this time of being exiled, if you will, to our homes, how we connect to God in the middle of that. And don't hear me wrong, I'm not saying you can't be mad at God. You can. God understands that. But you come back around in gratitude for all that God has done for us. The building is a building. It's a building that we love. Some of you have been here your whole lives. It is a building that you automatically connect to church. But all in all, it is a building. And you are those living stones. So, the question is how we will gather when we're able to gather. I'm getting a little committee together to try to talk about that. We won't be able to just open the door and walk back in. How will masks and staying 6 feet apart fit into the liturgy? I had somebody tell me, well, we wouldn't have any problem with the 6 feet distance because we don't have that many people. I think you're going to be surprised how many people want to come to the church, because absence makes the heart grow fonder. I don't know what it is, but I've had more people participate this way than actually came to the church. And maybe it's because they don't have to go outside. I don't know. But be prepared. It will be different. And we will get through it however we must. Whether we start with outside sermons, you can all come sit on my lawn 6 feet apart if you want, preferably when it's not raining. We can meet at the church somewhere. I have a baptism set up for church outside at the top of the cemetery. And that's part of God's activity also. So the one thing I want you to remember from today's service and sermon is that no matter what comes our way, God is in it with us. No matter what happens in the future with our building, we are still God's church. And whether or not our offerings, our finances are enough to keep things going, we are still the church. So hold on to that, folks. When you worship this Sunday, as I hope you do, the rest of the service, not just the sermon, pay attention to all the ways that I bring up that we can give thanks to God in a time when it seems like there's nothing to be thankful for. To God be the glory. Amen.